All right, I guess we'll get started. So hello and welcome everyone to the final day in our week-long lunchtime series entitled Ethical Issues in Pediatric Gene Therapy Clinical Trials. We're pleased to have had such a discussion thus far, and I'm very excited to introduce today's topic of operationalizing informed consent in pediatric gene therapy research. If you missed any of these week's talks, we will be posting recordings once the week has concluded, and we will share the link with all registrants. This lecture series is brought to you by the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, Division of Medical Ethics, and our working group on pediatric gene therapy and medical ethics, also known as PGTME. You can find more about PGTME by going to our website. We'll leave the link in the chat. And you can also sign up for our quarterly newsletter to stay updated on all of our work. So my name is Lesha Shah. I am an assistant professor and the medical director for Child, Adolescent and Family Services at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. And I also am co-chair of this Pediatric Gene Therapy and Medical Ethics Working Group. So for today's presentation, we'll have a presentation by Dr. Sandy Macrae, who I'll formally introduce in a moment. During his presentation, feel free to submit questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And following that presentation, there will be a brief response by Dr. Kaplan, who I also will introduce momentarily. We'll end this series by my posing questions to our panelists that you'll be submitting through the Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce first our respondent and then our speaker. Dr. Kaplan is the William F. and Virginia Connolly Mitty Professor and the founding head of the Division of Medical Ethics at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. He co-chairs the Compassionate Use Advisory Committee and is the author/editor of 32 books and more than 750 papers in peer-reviewed journals. Our initial speaker is Dr. Sandy Macrae. Dr. Macrae has served as Sangamo's president, chief executive officer, and a member of the board of directors since 2016. He has 20 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry, most recently serving as the global medical officer of Takeda Pharmaceuticals from 2012 to March of 2016, where he established and led the global medical office encompassing medical affairs, regulatory affairs, pharmacovigilance, outcomes research and epidemiology, quantitative science, and knowledge and informatics. So on that note, I'd like to thank Dr. Macrae in advance and turn the mic over to him.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to join your conversation. So can I get my first slide, please? So I want to talk about the practical issues in the journey that you've taken part in over this past week. You've had a lot of theoretical discussions about the ethics of genomic medicines and informed consent and how we move into our patients and children. And as the CEO of a genomic medicine company, I want to talk to you about some of the things that we think about that are the practical issues where the rubber hits the road, where we have to take that theoretical construct and make it real. Can I get the next slide, please? So this is the time for genomic medicines. Even in the 4 years that I've been responsible for Sangamo, there's been an enormous change in how people talk about and think about and invest in genomic medicine companies. What was 5 years ago or 10 years ago something that was largely an academic dream now has become a world of biotechnology companies and even pharmaceutical companies that are driving forward with enormously important medicines that could make a great difference to patients. And now is the time for us to have a discussion about bioethical considerations. This is something that everyone has an opinion on. If you ask people about changing their genes or becoming or editing their fundamental DNA, most of us have an opinion on it. And therefore, we as a community need to start the discussion now to make sure when we hit the bumps in the road or the issues that will inevitably come, that we've already got a very clear framework that allows us to discuss and address these issues. Can I get the next slide, please? And addressing unusual issues isn't easy. In the time of COVID, we have learned how little we as a society understand benefit and risk, how little we understand what we can be compelled to do and should do, how we deal with vulnerable people, whether it's children or elderly, and how we think about the risks that we're prepared to take for fundamental health benefit against the cost that that will incur. And I know that all of you have been thinking about, should you wear a mask? Should your family wear a mask? How will I think about vaccines? And it really does say how difficult this is, that we can sit and write papers about the intellectual construct, but the actuality of making day-to-day decisions is difficult. Next slide. And I want to try and frame this in a patient with a rare disease and how they would think about their disease. And this is Guy. Guy's a musician. He's in his early 30s. And after 10 years of symptoms that no one could quite get their head around or could give them a clear diagnosis, was diagnosed with Fabry disease. Next slide. And Guy found this very reassuring because it allowed him to understand the pains, the aches, the tingling, the temperature insensitivity, and also to understand the fate of the disease, because Fabry is an important disease that impacts your heart, your kidney, your brain, and is something where treatment is important and will alter the life expectancy of the patient. Next slide, please. But for people, patients like Guy, one of the most fundamental decisions they have to make is, should they be part of a clinical trial? There is an enormous effort to address these rare diseases that for so many years were left unaddressed. And now most of the patients that will be initiating treatment in these diseases do so as part of a clinical trial process. The thing is that the clinical trial process for a patient in genomic medicine is quite different from how you would, in my life previously at Takeda or GSK, if I was running clinical trials in a small molecule for diabetes or hypertension. And for those, you would probably dose the patient every day. There would be transient effects. And the effect would only be when it was in the system. And if once the patient stopped taking the drug, after a day or two or three, the drug would fade from the patient's blood, and they would have no ongoing risk or benefit. In contrast, the kind of genomic medicines that we would try and persuade Guy that he should explore have long-term, if not lifelong effects. And the treatments can't be reversed. Once you give the patient a virus that carries the genetic construct to the liver, it's going to stay in the liver for a very long time, and we hope for the rest of the patient's life. And therefore, that whole idea of what they're consenting for is quite different. Next slide. And we would propose that what they're actually doing is they're consenting for life. Now, this is a nice phrase, and I like the phrase because they're consenting to get a life, to get a new life, to have a hope for the treatment giving them a benefit, because any form of choice like this is about benefit and risk. And therefore, for genomic medicines, we are choosing very carefully to go into diseases where there really is a significant benefit to the patient that can be balanced against a risk that we're all learning to understand now and lasts for the rest of the patient's life. So when that patient writes their consent form, it's for something that will stay in their body for the rest of their life. And the area under the curve of risk is very long. Next slide. The patients that start these trials are remarkable people. And there's a concept that they often talk about called the hero dose. And what they mean when they talk about that is, if you're the first patient in a genomic medicine trial, you will have used up your one chance to take that medicine, because usually they're given by viruses and you then develop immunity to that virus. It started at a low dose because we want to do it prudently and safe, and you may not get a benefit. But by taking that first dose, it means that your friends, your fellow sufferers will be able to take doses at higher levels that are more likely to be effective. So the ones that go in first into these trials sometimes talk about taking one for the team. And they're doing it hoping that that dose will be effective, but knowing that it's most likely that the second and third and fourth cohort are the ones that will be effective. It truly is a remarkable thing. And most of these rare diseases have communities of patients that talk about this and talk about it openly, about their responsibility to the whole community. So the consent is not just for them, it's a consent that is really about a community of people that have a common disease. Next slide, please. So Guy will go and he will get the treatment, and the treatment that for genomic medicine are remarkably unremarkable. Usually it's sitting for a few hours and getting an infusion of a large number of virus particles that go to the liver at the moment and inoculate your liver with a construct encoding a new bit of DNA. Now, if Guy had been going for a simple hypertension trial, it would be transient effects, and the effect would be measured only in days. When he goes to get his genomic medicine, it has long-term effect that will be measured over a decade or lifetime. And risk over a long period accumulates. So as Guy's life moves forward, when he has children, is it passed on to them? We need to be able to show conclusively that that won't happen. When he's in his 80s and he develops colon cancer, we need to be able to be sure that that colon cancer was his fate, was what was going to happen to him anyway, rather than it being something that has been caused by an action that was given 50, 60 years ago. And all patients worry that the thing that was done to them or for them many years ago has an effect at later in their life. And we need to be prepared to follow them for long enough to be able to show them that there is no correlation between the genomic medicine they were given and what happens as they move through life and they have the medical events that would have happened anyway, and that they weren't precipitated or worsened by something that was done many years ago. Next slide, please. And that gets complicated because the connection between the patient and the treating physician can be lost in many ways. And as one thinks about a pediatric trial, we all know that the children in the pediatric hospital eventually get too big for those chairs in the waiting room and move on to an adult hospital. And suddenly there's a new physician that's looking after them. They go to college, their family moves, they pick up sticks and go to New York. And the connection between them and the person that with all good intent put them into this clinical trial is broken. So we need to find a way to be able to trace those patients and follow them. Next slide. But it's not just the patient that causes this. And I think more often it's the doctor. My experience is the patients in rare disease communities are incredibly loyal to their doctors and devoted to them and will fly all around the country to continue to see the doctors that started their treatment. But those doctors also have lives. they change institutions. They publish some ground study and then are promoted to become chair of medicine at the other side of the country. They retire, they even die. And that 10, 15, 20 years that is important to follow up the patient in the genomic medicine study is a long time in the life of a doctor. And very often that follow-up is lost. We need to find a way to reasonably follow these patients up. And as a company, we have an obligation to reasonably follow them up. What does reasonably mean? Does it mean that if they don't answer the first ring of the phone call, that I've fulfilled my obligation? Do I need to make sure that I've tried 5 times, 10 times? Do I need to insist that through the medical system, I can always track and understand what happened to them years ahead? That's a discussion that needs to happen. Currently, the FDA is recommending about 15 years as a reasonable follow-up on patients. I think we'll find with time that very little happens and there is very little for safety concern to worry about. But I can't say that definitively until we've done the work and we've understand enough patients. They're rare patients, there's very few of them, and therefore it is beholden on us within the industry to follow the patients in the long term, report them transparently, share the data, and make sure everyone gets confidence. Now, we in industry have the resources and the obligation and the societal responsibility to do this. Within this field, there's also many academic physicians that are able to do this and to treat their own patients in non-sponsored studies. When my question then becomes, when those physicians move on or professors move on, who pays for that research? Is it the hospital? Is it the doctor? Is it the NIH? Is it a grant-giving body? That's a part of the conversation I feel still needs to be solved. Next slide, please. And it's all academic. Next slide. Next slide. Because the consent form and the clinical trial process is just the first part of the process, and it can only treat a few patients, and it can only lead to a few patients getting benefit. What we're doing is designed to bring medicines to patients and to get approval from the agency, and then use the process of reimbursement and health insurance and the whole panoply of cornucopia of things that happen within the US system that gets our medicines to patients. And we would argue that the current system doesn't fit genomic medicines, where patients move from insurer to insurer, where they have to worry about pre-existing illness, where they have to worry about who pays for the follow-up and the blood test 10 years down the road. And to exaggerate the point, of course, we show that, when cars were originally invented, there was a concern about the speed of them. And so they would have someone standing in front with a red flag, slowing down the progress of the car. We mustn't do that because these genomic medicines are so important. Next slide. And we must be careful that we don't just try and shoehorn modern medicines into old technologies and into old systems. The patient is what's important. It isn't about the insurer, and I would argue it isn't even about the doctor. It's about following the journey of the patient and replanting the patient at the center of the discussion here. They're the ones that have to make the informed decision about something that's going to last them for the rest of their life. They're the ones that are most likely to carry that information about what happened for the rest of their life. They're the ones that in 10, 20, 30, 40 years' time will have to explain to a new doctor in a new state about what happens. And therefore we mustn't solve this for insurers or physicians, but for patients. Next slide, please. And we are evolving as a system, as a healthcare ecosystem, we're evolving. We've gone from fee-for-service, where you're sick, you pay, you get the tablet, you leave, to a world of value-based healthcare, where if I can show a benefit, I will get paid more, and my company will get paid more for showing continued benefit. What will it look like when we get to the point with genomic medicines, where even the company may not exist 10, 20, 30 years from now? How do we make sure that that reimbursement process addresses what's a long-term problem? Next slide. And that discussion's already happened, and I'm using our friends at Bluebird as an example. And Nick Leslie and the team at Bluebird have come up with some interesting concepts I feel help the rest of us think about this. And they have a treatment for sickle cell anemia and for beta thalassemia. And what they're proposing is, if you are treated with their cellular therapy, they will get 20% as an initial payment, and the other 80% of the payment, the cost of the drug, will be at risk. And each year they will get another 20%. So as by the end of the 5-year process, if the drug has continued to work and the patient hasn't required any other form of treatment, they will achieve the full 100% of the cost of the medicine. And as Nick will say, and at that point, the rest is free. So the 6th year, the 7th year, the 8th year, the 18th year, the patient doesn't pay, society doesn't pay. We have all paid over the first 5 years. And I think that works. But even in 5 years, how many times do you change your health insurer? How many times do you change your doctor? So it seems to me like a sensible balance, but it's something that even now is not as simple as it may seem. Next slide, please. And all these proposals and the discussion around it come with enormous bioethical issues that I think will serve the institutes of ethical studies like at NU with many papers for years to come. Guy is an adult, but we could and should probably be treating these patients with Fabry disease as children. And when one treats a child, one usually is doing it with an obvious near-term benefit. What does that look like when you treat the child and know that they are going to live with this bit of DNA in their body for the rest of their days, and that the decision you make now is something that is going to have potential consequences? One hopes not. I would even say one believes not, for the rest of their days. So the importance of going through that consent with the patient, with the parents who are about to let you treat a very vulnerable member of their family becomes even more important. We need to ensure that there's an appropriate risk reward. This isn't a treatment. These aren't treatments yet for hypertension or for, I would say, even lipid disorders. They're for serious diseases where there isn't either a good treatment or a successful treatment, or a treatment that allows the patient to be treated easily. There is about privacy. Long-term data will be best if it's shared, and therefore we have that constant battle between the benefit to the individual and the benefit to society from the data being either kept for the individual or shared across the many clinical trials. The monitoring time period, as I said, is long. And then there is a question that will inevitably come up about access. These medicines are expensive. They're expensive for many reasons. The whole process of developing them is complicated and costly. They are for very rare diseases, and therefore the number of patients that will eventually be treated and the return to the company that's invested all this money in is less. And they're often for communities that are either rare within the US or are found in countries that don't have the healthcare system and are resource poor and don't have the insurance system. And I think there's a balance and a discussion that will need to happen about how patients with these diseases get access. Sickle cell is a great example. Sickle cell is in the African American community in America. Often they're the people with that struggle with health insurance, and we need to make sure that the people that need it get access to it. But sickle disease is most prevalent in Africa, and some of these cell and gene therapies just are not affordable for the countries of Africa. So this is a debate that needs to happen. So as we understand who we're treating, who we're studying, and who will benefit from the clinical trials that happen. Next slide, please. Because it's down to the individual patient. So we talk of the ethics of the clinical trial process and of genomic medicines about patients in general, and we talk about it as a population problem, a societal problem. But in the end, it's down to patients like Guy that need to make a decision about whether he feels it's safe to get involved in a clinical trial that will have a lifelong impact. And therefore, we need to make sure that he is informed as possible, supported by the patient support groups, and followed, and that the information follows him for as long as possible. Next slide, please. And so the kind of things that we're thinking about at Sangamo is improving the informed consent. If you think of the process you go through for buying a car or buying a house, and the amount of time they take to make sure you understand what's happening. The informed consent in the current clinical process can be so much more fast and so much less informed. We need to make sure that that is improved. The patients are the ones that hold the information and will carry it through the rest of their days. And we've started a project at Sangamo to find a way to give them that information so they carry it with them for the rest of their life. And that could be, it could be a memory stick that includes the sequence of the bit of DNA that was given to them, the coding for the virus, the clinical results of the trial, because I feel that they are the people that are have the most skin in the game and most reliable to take this forward. We need to talk to them at the start about long-term follow-up. And the data sharing piece is something that requires groups above companies, and it's about the FDA or the NIH or the CDC, or it's about government bodies making sure that they gather the data together and they understand the implications of these important medicines. And finally, you've heard how important I feel access for all this. Next slide, please. This is the start of a journey. These are important medicines. If they are successful, patients like Guy will have a complete revolution in their life. Already the patients treated with Sangamo's hemophilia A medicine have stopped taking factor and are living normal lives, doing things that they never dreamt of. And the future is more. The future is about editing and addressing diseases, whether they are rare at the moment and increasingly common diseases, MS, Crohn's disease. There's an enormous potential for these medicines, but we need to do them wisely and prudently, taking the necessary time. So thank you.
Next up, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kaplan.
Thanks, Lesha, and thanks, Sandy, for that really useful overview of some of the more unique aspects of trying to move forward in this space. I think especially important was your paying a lot of attention to the long-term consequences of being in research with gene therapy, that people are going to need to be followed for a long time, that it's hard to, if not impossible at present, to reverse anything or change anything. And I think also the notion of who goes first, literally first, is a tough issue requiring some careful consent. That isn't unique to gene therapy. I remember in the early days of the first artificial hearts, it was pretty clear that being the first subject was being more like an astronaut than it was being someone who was in a normal trial, because they still didn't really know what was going to happen to the first subject who got a Jarvik heart way back in the 80s. And as it happened, the first subject who got it had a horrible time with the heart. They learned things that they didn't see in animals, and it proved to be a very courageous but difficult assignment to be patient number one. I would say patient number one taught things, but patient number one didn't really benefit. But I have to say, at that time, the consent was full of benefit. The consent was very optimistic, and I don't think it carried through on the idea that when you're very early in some of these gene therapy trials, whatever they may be, whatever style is being used, partly you're going to be not just at greater risk, but part of the job is to let people learn a bit more about doses and modes of administration and many other questions that they don't fully understand. So I'm going to confine my comments so we have time for discussion to something under 2 hours. No, it's a joke. There's a lot to be said here, but I'll try and be relatively brief. I want to say something about an experience I had with parents and children not too long ago with respect to consent. I want to say something about solid organ transplant, because it's one area which is somewhat akin to gene therapy in that you put it in and it lasts for 30 years. And it's a one-time.
But you can
could take it back out, but for your heart, it's not a good idea. You really don't want to be doing that too often. Occasionally there's a retransplant and something happens, but again, like gene therapy, you've got a somewhat immunosensitized recipient and things can get sticky. And as Sandy knows, and others know, I've been around transplant a long time, so I've had a lot of experience watching consent in that context and registries. And then I'm going to start with just moaning about something. Some of our colleagues here at NYU and I have been writing over the past few years about the difficulty of putting in place an adequate plan for compensation for injury for people who either are harmed or think they're harmed in gene therapy experiments, but for that matter, in any experiment. And it is somewhat scandalous that at this point in time, maybe 40 years after the initial regulations came out post-Tuskegee and Willowbrook on human experimentation protection, that we still don't have an adequate compensation policy in place for human subjects. And that covers gene therapy too. So in getting consent, sometimes what people are told, and I've seen some of the consent forms, not from Sandy's company, I'm just talking more generally about gene therapy informed consent forms, they often have boilerplate in them that says, if something goes wrong, we'll cover the costs of your care, and then we will pursue reimbursement from your insurance company, at which point I break into hilarious laughter because the insurance company's not paying for anything that's experimental, ever.
Yeah.
And what you're telling the subject is, we'll pay your direct costs. Now, in India some years ago, maybe 2 or 3, the government there said, hey, that's great news. So you're going to provide healthcare for the rest of the patient's life for everything that might be alleged to go wrong. And as Sandy also knows, there was some balking about that. I got a lot of phone calls from Big Pharma saying, how do we get out of India? How do we can't be healthcare providers for life. But when Sandy is talking about monitoring somebody, for a lifetime, or looking for possible effects, not that we expect that to happen like him, I don't really think you're going to see things 20 years later, but we can't leave our subjects in the lurch, and we can't fudge the consent. And I think it's a mistake to imply that if things really go wrong, sue us, because that is in a sense what the American policy is. It's not true worldwide, but it's true in a lot of places. We've looked at the compensation policies. So while people aren't thinking when they sign up, what's going to happen to me if I do get injured, or I think I get injured, or I may need some interventions. We've got to fix that. It's a real hole in the consent process. It's a real hole in trying to say the patients are our partners, the patients are going to work with us. The second thing I wanted to just tell you about is an experience I had where some years ago I was asked to be, or I worked it out with investigators, that I would be a devil's advocate. When people came in with children for a particular form of gene therapy, my job was to talk them out of it. No bones about it. I was Mr. Negativity. I would say, here's what could go wrong. Here's all the things that could happen. Let's take a little tour through the ICU, and we'll take a look at what happens in things like bone marrow transplant when someone has a bad outcome. I want you to fully understand that things could go wrong. We can't really show you what happens if someone turns out like Jesse Gelsinger because he's not with us, but we're going to give you, and I'm going to give you the grimmest news possible and tell you why I think maybe you don't want to do this. Maybe your window period is too short, or they don't know what they're doing on the dosing. So I met with roughly 10 families who made it to a large academic medical center. And my ability to talk anybody out of anything was zero. And I wasn't fully surprised by that, but we have to understand when people come with children to gene therapy, there are a number of factors that are in play that make me dubious about informed consent. I don't trust it. One is the people who make it to the big academic center or knock on Sandy's door are ready to take the risk. They've already sort of said, we're going ahead. You can tell them anything, and they're going. They're not going to be, it's not a deliberative process at that point. Second, they want hope. Those are the people who are really looking for something. And I'm not saying that informed consent takes away hope, but it could and it can. And I would say, in my experience, many parents don't want to hear the downside of risk. They want hope. And, you know, we can't lie in the name of hope, but it's very difficult to say that as someone trying to present informed consent, that I'm going to be able to really give the downside, the risk, the need to be followed up for a lifetime, the problem of being in the first dose cohort and all the rest of it. It's just tough. So I'm going to say, that's why I'm a big believer that you have to have careful IRB review. You have to have published data to allow the community to say, yes, it is time to try CAR T cells or zinc talon manipulation or whatever platform it is, Sandy's company that wants to move forward. I don't trust informed consent with kids and parents. And when cultures say it's better to do something than nothing, it's better to act than not to act. And that is what our cultures say. And by the way, that's what our religions say too, about what your duties are to your kids. I think consent
so
is...
how different do you think that will be to, so if we agree that if it was my child and I was desperate, I'll take the risk. Are we being paternalistic? Are we being overcautious? Are we not understanding the life-threatening thing in front of us? How do we avoid that?
Yeah,
with this construct?
I don't begrudge the parents the right to take risks and try to do what they think is best. They live with the kids. Doctors, ethicists pass by fleetingly and then go home, and the kid goes back with the parents, and they deal. So they have privilege of place, and I accept that. But I do think vetting the science independently from the optimism of the company and the researchers becomes crucial, very, very crucial. It's the other protection, if you will, and I think we've got to take it more seriously. I don't like a lot of the science by press release that's going on around us, even with vaccines. It's undermining, if you will. I'm not even so crazy about the premature publication online, those sites that are doing early release of data without peer review, the sort of rapid publication outlets that make me nervous. Because I think for innovative things, you really want to be tough on the science end, torture the researchers, and the companies that way, the consent is tough. Last thing I'll say, solid organ transplant has not done a good job following up people. That's what I wanted to say. There are centers that do it as if there were individual companies that do it. In the case of transplant, some centers publish data and have registries on their heart outcomes and their multi-organ outcomes and their kid outcomes and the different immunosuppressive registries they use. But here's 3 points to watch out for. Almost none of them are uniform or interchangeable in how they keep and store data. So we need somebody to start to become in charge, so that if I say to a person, I'm going to follow you for 20 years, or we're going to be in a registry that will follow you, that we're sure it's standardized and we can merge data and get the maximum output.
Yep.
Not that every platform, Sandy knows this very well, his company has some unique things they do and not everybody else does them, but when possible, and transplant has failed, just failed, because there's no authority to say, you guys, here's the template, and maybe in gene therapy, we're early enough that we could do it. The other failure I see is they don't share. They just don't share information. Sometimes people publish. In other situations, for various reasons, equity and trying to get the latest immunosuppressive thing or finding a drug that might get you off of immunosuppression, they sit on the data, and I mean sit on it like years. I'm not talking about sit on it like months. There are also pressures to publish that lead people to say, I can't share, even if something's important, I got to get it in the journal won't take it. We've got to reform that area so that we're not lying to our patients when we say we're going to follow you and, we'll benefit from following you. Journal editors have to find a way to say, here's the data, we can share it, but we'll still publish. There has to be ways to make sure that people understand that they're obliged to share information with their peer groups if they have important findings. It's just not done well in transplant. And that's an area that is perhaps slightly analogous to the lifetime journey of gene therapy. So those are things I would watch for and comment on. Nothing inconsistent with Sandy's positions, but maybe some tweaks or ability.
But I think your reflections on solid organ transplant are wise, and we are early enough. There haven't been that many patients treated that we could do it now. We could bring this into play.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the, I'll end by saying that's the editorial that Sandy and I have yet to write, but we got to do it because that call is very, very important. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kaplan, for your insights and response, and Dr. Macrae for a very informative and thought-provoking presentation. So I'll turn it over to our audience, actually, because we have a number of questions waiting. And so I think both of you really spoke to the idea about consenting for life and the importance of long-term follow-up. And so to combine some of our questions, one of our attendees said, doctors and patients move, insurance changes, companies can be bought or sunsetted. And so how do we monitor patients across a lifetime and ensure that patients are not lost to follow-up? And related to that, how do we do this while preserving patient privacy when it comes to genomics? And also, how do we do this for maybe patients that were enrolled as pediatric patients that then transition into being adults, where consent was actually initially through a guardian or surrogate? So.
Well, I'm calling in today from Scotland, and we have socialized medicine here that means that the patient is followed wherever they go and through the whole of the National Health Service. And I think that makes it easier in countries like that. But we need to find something that is above health insurance, above companies, and above doctors. That is it a not-for-profit? Is it some kind of holding process that will bring all this data together? Because I think what they could do is some of the things that Art was saying about setting up how we will do it very early on, the information that we will gather to make sure that it isn't over intrusive to the patient, that they will look at privacy and make sure the information is only used for the good purpose and is appropriately anonymized. And will have a lifetime that is longer than tenure in an academic institution, or sometimes the life of a company.
And so I guess maybe to follow up on that, these ideas about data sharing and data storage, what might be some mechanisms for coordination, given we don't have great consensus guidelines at present?
I mean, for me,
Art.
I think what we need to do is have almost a kind of guideline setting conference with many of the players there, and say, we've got some statisticians here, we've got some health services researchers here, we have other registry examples. There have been successes. Some groups, the ACOG groups and so on, have done a pretty good job. And some aspects of what we're doing are unique. But let's set out an agreed upon convention, or let's set out an agreed upon standard, and maybe have some penalties. That is to say, if you're going to get published, you have to be a member of this thing. You got to do it this way. And, it's not just aspirational, it's mean and tough.
I think that sounds very reasonable.
Yeah, I think we just got a second question about the same thing, but I think you answered it, Art and Sandy. So I might ask another question about early phase research, given a lot of the gene therapies are first in human studies. And as Dr. Macrae mentioned, there are these hero doses. And so the framework for clinical research in gene therapy is so different from other clinical research in terms of that first dose and therapeutic benefit. And so is that always embedded in the consent? And so that prospect of benefit for someone that is the first or second patient dosed versus someone later, and how is this actually explained to patients or families when there are concerns about being underdosed with early enrollment?
So we have a very open conversation with the agency about what dose we start at, and we try and convert the animal data that we have into what that means the human data is across clinical trials. We only have a limited number of correlations to be able to predict what the efficacy is between mouse, monkey, and human. So we learn each time we go in, and I see it to start at, but their job is first to protect patients, and therefore they will be cautious about what dose they start. We talk to patients about this, but actually I'm always impressed at how knowledgeable the patients themselves are. And particularly in rare diseases, there are patient communities that are aware of every drug that is being developed, and it's a shared conversation between the companies, the doctors, the patients, and the patient communities.
I would say, in my experience, for some trials, what I do see is a more generic consent saying the dosing is going to go 3, 6, 9, 12, but it doesn't really say, at 3, here's the limits, and at 12, here's they're not particularized or individualized as much as I might like to see. We could do a little better on the written side, but as Sandy said, hopefully that comes up in the oral or the communications part of the consent.
So are you suggesting that you might say, if you're in the first cohort, here's the benefit risk for you. If you're in the last cohort, it's a different benefit risk discussion? I
would. And I also don't see them updated as much as you might like. We got to patient 8 out of 15, and this is how it looks right now. He seems pretty safe. Nobody's had any bad reactions. Again, doesn't mean that one won't happen at 12 or whatever, but a little more particularized and individualized, I think. I mean, on the written side, I do think you're right. The conversations tend to be a little more particularized.
Because for the gene therapies, there's always, I think, a safety monitoring committee that says cohort 1 was safe and will allow you to go forward to the next one. Now, they also see efficacy data for cohort 1. So there's something, there is more information available for the next patient to take.
Right. So
cohort 2.
Here's my whine about that, and then I'll let Lesha get us on.
Yeah, I think that's the part that's key, is collecting that efficacy data so early on, which is somewhat unusual, and then the risk for toxicity.
The problem is, even when you have the DSMBs working, and I'm all for them and like them, sometimes have sat on them, they don't communicate to the IRB, and that loop is not closed with respect to consent. So they're talking to the sponsor, and that's great. But we haven't figured out what to do about the IRB to the DSMB to the informed consent. That still remains a not closed loop.
Yeah. So I'll turn over to maybe a slightly different question, because I know we heard a little bit about funding models, investment, and reimbursement. So how might we enable companies to attract the investment that's needed to develop these therapies, particularly in the rare disease spaces, while also ensuring that they're accessible?
You have to get Sandy back on planes, get him out of Scotland.
Well, it's interesting you ask, because my next call immediately after this is for an initiative that the NIH and FDA have been talking about creating a foundation for rare diseases. So there are 7,000 rare diseases in the liver, of which there's about 10 or 20 that are sufficiently large that it's easy enough to do clinical trials, and the economics of them make sense. And I know that sounds a hard way to look at it, but if there's a population of patients with where there's half a dozen patients with a rare disease, and it's costing 100, 200, 300 million to develop it, it's hard to find the investment to treat those patients. But sitting in companies like ours, there's the knowledge about manufacturing vectors, gene therapies, that if we made that treatment available through the NIH or the FDA or some foundation, it may be possible that ultra rare diseases, the vast majority of rare diseases, could be treated by academic groups or consortia in a not-for-profit basis. It's the only way, I think, that the ultra rare, the ones with a handful of patients, and each patient is precious for their handful of parents, it's the only way that I think they'll be addressed.
I would maybe, as a follow-up, ask about issues of access in genomic medicine in general. What are we learning about access that's so different from traditional trials and drug development, and how we think about access very differently in genomic medicine in particular?
Up until now, the genomic medicines have been for awful diseases in small children, or where life and death is at stake. We're about to register 2 drugs, one of them a Sangamo drug with Pfizer in the next 3 years, and the Bioethical drug for hemophilia. And that's a significant population of patients. So I think the conversation will have to be had for that medicine. Those patients will argue that their life will be completely transformed. They won't need to take factor. And if the cost of treatment over a lifetime is 6 million, and the cost of total healthcare is 20 or 30 million for those patients, the benefit to society and the money that's being taken out of the system by coming up with a gene therapy is enormous. And it's just how we think of that, the bill upfront compared to the cost of treating the patient over a lifetime. So I think the hemophilia discussion will open that for the first time with a reasonable number of patients, and force the conversation to happen.
So one side comment, we on the vaccine front, we're seeing all kinds of hurry it up, emergency use, get it out there. It's a crisis. And I will say, every patient group that I know of, including those in gene therapy, are watching and saying, hey, if you're going to speed everything up, I'm dying too, or I'm getting disabled quickly. You better speed it up for me too. And I think we'll see fallout from that, which will change reliance on real world evidence, people's thinking about how big a trial needs to be, and many other things, because as I said, people are watching what's going on in the UK and the US with EU regulators in terms of rolling vaccines out in a perceived emergency or crisis, and they're not indifferent to that.
Quite true. Quite true.
Go to another question from our audience. So can a patient be an informed volunteer to take this risk as patient one for an entire community? So is that ethical to enroll entirely as a volunteer, not expecting to benefit? And then another question about patient one and randomization. So maybe speaking to randomization in clinical trial design.
Most often these trials are open label, or sorry, they are, there's no placebo treatment in it. So all the patients are getting active drug. The patients are aware that the trial is starting. They are very savvy of the rising doses, and that the benefit is greater the further down. And the patient communities just feel that this is important for them and for others. So it isn't our discussion, it's their discussion, I think.
Remember too, for some of them, I guess I'll ask this more to Sandy, but for some of them, there is a window where they have to try it. And even though it may be a lower dose of the first dose, if they don't do it, they're outside the window for some of these things, say for growth drugs, for growth plates and things like that. So occasionally you want to go because it's your only chance to go.
And the first dose that we treat our patients with, we feel there is usually it's not unreasonable that they will get benefit. So it's not that they're getting a 10th or 100th of the possible dose. They're as close to as we can do prudently, remembering that safety and patient safety is the most important thing. So there is a possibility they'll get it, but there's a probability that the higher doses will get benefit.
Thank you. Another question in terms of informed consent. Often we like patients to be informed of all of the alternatives, and this is quite variable in gene therapies based on which disease we're talking about. Sometimes there are other disease modifying options, and other times there are not. So is that part of the informed consent process of informing patients of what their alternatives are, and whether some of those alternatives might actually be other gene therapy trials, and what that means for their eligibility for others?
So I can just tell you one experience. I am an advisor, I will confess, on the hemophilia gene therapy for BioMarin. And there are a lot of folks, not a lot, there are some folks who really believe that the existing treatments for hemophilia are perfectly fine and they work and you ought to take them, and they're not so gung-ho, if you will, about gene therapy. And I think the consents there try to tell people about their options, and they should, and that's fine. But it surprised me a little bit, the vehemence with which defenders of the older treatments, which by the way don't get rid of the disease, you have to keep using them as long as you're alive, and that could be pretty burdensome. But yeah, sometimes it is there, and making sure you let them know, there is X. Now again, as Sandy said too, the patient groups are well aware of all this, but it has come up there.
So with that, I think we're almost at time. So I did want to thank both Dr. Macrae and Dr. Kaplan for a really wonderful discussion, and one that I anticipate will continue. And so I also want to share appreciation for two of our staff, both Kara Hunt, our project manager for the Pediatric Gene Therapy and Medical Ethics Working Group, as well as John Massarelli, who's a research associate in the Division of Medical Ethics. Both of them, we extend our tremendous appreciation for their extensive coordination and really earnest diligence in putting this series together. And on behalf of PGTME, I want to thank all of you that have really participated, attended, and brought this series to fruition. So thank you all. and we'll be in touch, and these recordings will be available, and the links are in the chat if you'd like to be kept abreast of our work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.